Hi class, welcome to lesson 3 of unit 6, and this will be another one of these lectures that brings us ever closer to the breakout of the Civil War, and we're going to pick up pretty much where we left off in the last lecture. So in the last lecture, we were talking about how in 1850 you had the Compromise of 1850 and its Fugitive Slave Act raise sectional tension, and then 2 years later in 1852 you see Uncle Tom's Cabin also raise sectional tension as the North becomes more and more aware of what slavery is like and becomes more and more against slavery. This rising of tension is just going to continue throughout this lecture. This lecture actually chronologically only covers a period of about 6 years, but this is a very dense 6 years in which a lot of dramatic events happen that bring us closer to the brink of the Civil War. By the end of this lecture, we will be getting ready for the election of Abraham Lincoln and the Southern response to that. So basically, this tension again between the North and the South, this feeling from the Southern states that they are being attacked by the North, being attacked by Northern abolitionists, being attacked by Northerners that were against the spread of slavery. That tension that the South feels is going to increase, and the Northern tension to a desire among Northerners to attack slavery is going to increase. So both sides, you will see the tension increase over the course of these 6 intense years that are covered in this lecture. So in 1853, the idea of building a transcontinental railroad had gotten increasingly popular. One of the reasons for that is that California had just come in as a state, and California was a very wealthy state, but it was almost like an island separated from the rest of the states. Yes, we had territory between California and the rest of the states, but we did not exactly have a direct, fast connection to California. If you wanted to go to California before this time period, or even during the 1850s, you pretty much had to go on foot or on horseback or with a carriage, horse and buggy type situation, a wagon. So to speed up the process of getting to California, the desire for a transcontinental railroad increased in the country. And this map is taken from after the Civil War, after we had kind of settled the slavery issue, and you see several transcontinental railroads at that point. This map takes place later on, though, before the Civil War. If this map were to be in the 1850s, say 1853, this part would be blank. There would be no railroads. And the desire was to connect the wealthy California state to the rest of the states. The question, though, was where would you build this railroad? So the North wanted to build a route that was more northern, say up in this region. The South wanted to build a transcontinental railroad that was further south, say down here. And there was a reason behind that. The reason behind that is that wherever a railroad was built, the population would increase. And wherever the population would increase, you would increase the likelihood of being able to qualify for statehood. Now, if you remember in the last lecture, I talked about the Compromise of 1850 and about how there were two territories, one above the 3630 line and one below the 3630 line. And there was this idea that they would get to choose on their own whether or not to be free or slave. Well, both the North and the South kind of wanted to build a railroad through the territory that aligned with their side in the hopes that the population there would increase and therefore they would get more states. Interestingly, the South gets the head start on this with what's known as the Gadsden Purchase. So the Gadsden Purchase was a purchase of land. You see it highlighted here. Very small piece of land. And the United States is going to buy this small piece of land from Mexico for, I think, $10 million, which was a lot of money considering how small the piece of land was. Why did the United States do this? Well, the reason was because there was a desire to build a transcontinental railroad along a southern route. This is something the Southerners would have liked, and it would go from Houston all the way to Los Angeles. However, the land from the Mexican Cession, if you went through that land, the canyons and the mountains were just too rough to build any railroads. If you could go just south of the Mexican Cession, just south of the New Mexico Territory through this area, the land got smoother and building a railroad would be more likely. And so what the government does is they buy that small strip of land, and the purpose was to help begin the construction of a southern transcontinental railroad. Another reason it made sense at this point to build a southern transcontinental railroad is because all of this area here that I'm showing you was already part of a state, therefore organized, had law and order. And then this part over here was organized, had law and order. Most of the railroad would go through existing states. So the reactions to this, obviously, the South likes this idea because they say, oh, we could maybe make one or two or maybe even more states out of the New Mexico territory once we have a railroad going through it and boosting its population. And if that happens, these can become pro-slave states. Slavery can expand out west, which is kind of an interesting notion given that most of that area is desert. But they thought that slavery could expand. They said that there would be more pro-slavery states in the Senate, and then they could protect slavery going into the future. The North, however, does not want to have a southern route. They want a northern route. They want to see more states in the northern part of the country being formed. They want to basically build a railroad that brings more population to the northern part of the West, and if they can do that, then they can have some northern states form, and maybe those northern states will, through popular sovereignty, become free states. So basically, the North and the South are going to be fighting over where to build a transcontinental railroad, but it does relate to the issue of slavery in the West, because wherever the railroad went, the newest states would come in, and those states would be either free or slave, depending on where the railroad was. So at this point, a northern senator named Stephen Douglas is going to try to become the next Henry Clay. By the way, the great Henry Clay, who I've talked about so many times, has died by this point. And so you'll have Stephen Douglas try to become, if you will, the next Henry Clay. He's a poor man's Henry Clay at best, and he's going to develop what's known as the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And before I even get into the details of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, let me go ahead and tell you that this turns out to be one of the most disastrous laws in American history. So what happens? Under the Kansas-Nebraska Act, well, actually, the purpose first. The purpose was to try to organize the rest of the Louisiana Territory, turn it into states, and therefore, if you have states here, it's much more likely that a railroad will be built through this route. So what ends up happening, though, is that if you build a transcontinental railroad through this proposed route, which you see here, and by the way, this does end up becoming the route later on, if you build a route through here, this area is going to become populated, and this area will turn into states. And the South was very concerned because all of this land was above the 3630 line from the Missouri Compromise, which meant that any land that came out of this and became states would be automatically, according to the Missouri Compromise, free. So any land, again, according to the Missouri Compromise, above the 3630 line, shown here, that was talked about in the past, any of this could become states. If it became states, this land became states, they would all be free states, according to Henry Clay's deal. Now, remember, Henry Clay has just died, and he's not really there to defend the Missouri Compromise anymore, and the Missouri Compromise is about to go out the window. And remember that the purpose of this was to organize this territory that's shown here so that the likelihood of building a northern transcontinental railroad would rise. So what are the terms of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which again turns out to be a disaster? First of all, the Missouri Compromise gets repealed. Out goes the 3630 line, out goes the idea that this area could not have slavery, and the reason that Stephen Douglas decides on this is because it basically will bring the Southern senators and the Southern congressmen on board with this law. So how does he work that out? Well, the Southerners might get some slave states out of this, and then the Northerners will get a transcontinental railroad. So it looks like it might work out almost like another great compromise. Another one of the terms is going to be that the rest of the Louisiana Territory is going to be carved into two territories, the Nebraska Territory here, that I'm circling, and the Kansas Territory down here. And the idea regarding slavery for both of these is that both of these territories would be allowed to determine whether or not they would turn into slaveholding states using popular sovereignty. And I've already told you in the previous lecture how popular sovereignty, though it might sound good on paper, doesn't always work out. Now, Stephen Douglas probably thought he was pretty clever because he had Nebraska territory right next to this land, which was non-slaveholding land. Similarly, you have Kansas next door to Missouri, which was a slaveholding state. So I think what Stephen Douglas was hoping for was that Nebraska would become free, Kansas would become slave, and you would maintain at least some sort of fairness or some sort of balance between free and slave states, even though that balance had already been tipped in the favor of the free states by the Compromise of 1850 when California came in. It seemed like a good idea to Stephen Douglas. It seemed like a good idea to a lot of people in Congress. It's going to turn out, however, to be a disaster because of the way that people react. So what ends up happening is that a lot of Northerners are going to be very angry about this new law because it repealed another law that had been around for 34 years. It repealed the Missouri Compromise. And remember how important the Missouri Compromise was. The Missouri Compromise had basically settled the issue of slavery in the West, at least in the Louisiana Territory, and it kept tempers down, and it kept tension down, and it kept sectionalism down. Now that Missouri Compromise is gone, and Henry Clay was gone too, so he couldn't defend it anymore. So Northerners, especially the abolitionists, and especially the people that had seen the Fugitive Slave Act in action, or the Northerners that had read Uncle Tom's Cabin, are going to be very upset that the federal government has repealed the Missouri Compromise, and all of a sudden it's possible for slavery to expand westward again. Free Soilers are going to be upset about this. In fact, you're about to see a brand new political party form that's much bigger than the Free Soil Party in reaction to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and I'll get into that in a moment. So remember what I said before, where I said that the idea was that anti-slavery people, free state people would move into Nebraska, and that pro-slavery people would move into Kansas. In the end, Northerners tried to get both. And so Northerners are going to move into Nebraska, where they already have a good chance of turning it into a free state, but they're also going to start pouring into Kansas as well, at the same time that Southerners start pouring into Kansas. So remember that you have both pro-slavery and anti-slavery people. And some of these anti-slavery people are abolitionists. Some of them are free soilers that aren't abolitionists. But basically you have pro and anti-slavery people pouring into one state and trying to decide what kind of state it will be through popular sovereignty, and they cannot agree, and they will fight, and it will get bloody. So this law ends up becoming very controversial, and the results of this law, which will be Bleeding Kansas, and I'll come to that shortly, becomes very controversial, so much so that political parties are going to split. Now, in an earlier unit, we talked about the creation of the Democratic Party. It kind of created in response to the rise of Andrew Jackson and the rise of the common man. Now I'm going to talk about the origins of the Republican Party. There is your first Republican president, eventually Abraham Lincoln. I'll talk more about him, as you can guess, later on. So in 1854, in direct reaction to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Republican Party forms. Anyone that was against slavery in the North, whether they be a Whig, whether they be a Democrat, and especially the Free Soilers, they're all going to get together because they hate the Kansas-Nebraska Act and because they hate the idea of slavery expanding westward, and they are going to form a brand new political party, the Republican Party. This party is going to be popular in the North. It's also going to be popular in the West. Now, the Republican Party, the primary part of its platform arguably was that it was against slavery in the West. Again, not because they were abolitionists, although some were, but because they did not think that the West should have slavery to compete with free white labor. They didn't want to have to compete with slaves for jobs. The Republican Party did have some other goals. Some of these goals still exist with the Republican Party today. For example, they are very pro-business. They want to see business growth. They want to see economic growth in the country. They are also very pro-westward expansion. They wanted to build transcontinental railroads. But again, they saw this this expansion westward, this expansion of businesses as really something to be benefiting white Americans. They did not want slavery going out west because they thought that that would undermine the economic growth of the West. And again, just like the Free Soil Party, a lot of the Republicans did not want slavery to expand westward because they did not want whites to have to compete against slave labor. Did abolitionists join the Republican Party? Yes, some of them did. Frederick Douglass did. They didn't agree with everything the Republicans said, but Frederick Douglass would have said to himself that keeping slavery from expanding westward is a step in the right direction, so I will join up with the Republicans. And the Republican Party is going to become very popular in the North because of its pro-business views and because of its anti-slavery in the West views. And it's going to become very popular among the few western states like California because they wanted to build a railroad that would connect the rest of the country to states like California. The South, however, is feeling very threatened by the Republican Party. They see this as a threat to slavery. They say to themselves, if the Republicans ever get a president elected, then maybe we should leave the United States. And sure enough, that's what happens when this man, Abraham Lincoln, becomes president, is that southern states start to secede from the United States. More on that in the next lecture. So at this point, the Republican Party is formed. It believes in many things, but its primary platform is that slavery could not expand westward. Could slavery exist where it already was? Yes. But it could not expand westward. But to the Southerners, keeping slavery from expanding was the same thing as trying to kill it. We'll talk more about the growth of the Republican Party. We'll talk more about the rise of Abraham Lincoln later. Now let's go back to Kansas. What's going on in Kansas? Well, for the next couple years, things get pretty tense in Kansas. And honestly, things are going to be tense in Kansas from here all the way till the time of the Civil War breaking out. So what happens in Kansas is that abolitionists from the North and Free Soilers, but more notably abolitionists, are going to move into Kansas. You're also going to see people cross the border from Missouri into Kansas, known as border ruffians. These are slave owners. They're both going to go into Kansas, and they're basically going to both try to create a government for Kansas that outlaws the other one. One of these governments is going to be a pro-slavery government. One of these governments is going to be an anti-slavery government. And so the territory breaks out into civil war over what kind of state it will be. And it does get very violent. If you look at the picture at the upper right, you can see how towns sometimes would be set on fire. Hundreds of people were getting killed. I'll tell you about a particular violent person in a moment who's a very interesting character in American history. But one thing you should note before I introduce this man is that popular sovereignty ultimately is a failure because letting a state decide on its own only works if the population of that state can agree. And the population of Kansas could not agree over whether to become a free state or a slave state. And really what happens in Kansas becomes a microcosm of what's going to happen throughout the rest of the country later on. So, in other words, just as Kansas Territory couldn't decide whether it wanted to be a free or a slave state, and people fought over it, ultimately, the United States as a whole will fail to decide if it's going to be free or if it's going to be slave. And it's going to have a war over it, the Civil War. And even Abraham Lincoln will say that the country cannot persist either half slave or half free. It has to become one or the other because the country could not compromise and have it both ways. Neither could Kansas. Okay, so if you look at this picture here, you'll see John Brown. John Brown is one of the most intense Americans that I've ever heard of in American history, and he was an abolitionist, and he was a white abolitionist, which shows that even though he was not black, he had never been a slave, he still felt so strongly against slavery that he was willing to commit violence, and ultimately he's going to be willing to die for the cause of abolitionism. So what does John Brown do? John Brown goes out to Kansas. He goes out with some of his sons. He considered himself to be a very religious man, and he felt that it was God's mission for him to, quote, to break the jawbone of slavery. It was his mission to get rid of slavery by any means necessary. He goes out to Bleeding, Kansas, and commits murder, and he has to kind of hide out, I think, for a while afterwards, because what he does is he goes and he finds 5 slave owners, and they may not have even been slave owners. They might have just been in favor of slavery. That might have been it. However, he is going to take these 5 people with his sons. They're going to go down to a creek called Pottawatomie Creek, and there John Brown and his sons are going to not stab, but hack to death these pro-slavery people. So he murders slave owners, he murders pro-slavery people in very violent, very nasty fashion, and that's how strongly he believed in getting rid of slavery. Some people saw John Brown as a hero that would do anything necessary to fight against slavery. Other people thought that he had crossed over the line into insanity, and that he was crazy to be willing to hack people to death based off of their stance on slavery. Historians still debate over his sanity today, so far as I know. So John Brown's actions become the I guess the best example of how bad things were getting in Kansas. And if you look at that picture there, you see this image of him with a beard, and he has a Bible in one hand and a gun in the other. And he was using violence to fulfill his religious beliefs against slavery. And if you look here, you can see that he is kind of foreshadowing the Civil War. You'll see there a Confederate flag, and you'll see there a United States flag, the fighting going on there, which in a sense he kind of foreshadowed. So the violence gets worse. News of things like what John Brown is doing, and just news of Bleeding Kansas in general, reach the United States Congress, and violence even breaks out in Congress. So in 1856, a man named Charles Sumner is going to make a speech in the Senate. He was a senator from Massachusetts, and he's going to make a speech that's famously called The Crime Against Kansas, and he's going to call out the slave states. He's going to say that it's their fault that Bleeding Kansas is happening, and he is especially going to call out a senator from South Carolina. And I'm going to paraphrase this, but he's basically going to say to the guy from South Carolina that South Carolina has a really nasty girlfriend that's basically a prostitute, and likes to parade this prostitute around as if it's some great girlfriend to have, but everybody else knows that this girlfriend's actually a prostitute, and that prostitute is slavery. I know what I just said sounds really out there, but if you do the primary source activity that's related to Bleeding Kansas and you read his speech, you'll see that I'm not really exaggerating. That's pretty much what he says. He is basically using the most brutal attacking language that he can to call out the South and blame them for Bleeding Kansas, and especially to call out South Carolina. So what ends up happening is that there's going to be a congressman from South Carolina that's working on the other side of the Capitol building. And whenever he hears about this, he's going to grab a cane, a wooden cane that was about 1 inch in diameter, and he's going to go and attack Charles Sumner. He's going to beat him in the back of the head. He nearly beats him to death with a cane. And this is going on in the Senate. This is going on in what is supposed to be a civilized government. And now at this point, people even in government are attacking each other physically. Sumner did a very vicious verbal attack, and that was followed by Preston Brooks launching a very nasty physical attack on Charles Sumner. Charles Sumner ends up being in a coma for a while. He has to go to Europe for special medical treatment. Eventually, he will live to come back and serve in the Senate. And again, this is going to be very representative of the sectionalism of the time. Here's another depiction of the same event. And the cane does break during the beating of Charles Sumner. That's how badly he's getting hit. So the North obviously is going to be outraged by this event. Even though Charles Sumner is in a coma, the people of Massachusetts are going to keep electing him into the Senate, even though his seat at the Senate is going to be empty because he's too unwell to serve. The South is going to love this, and when the South hears that the cane was broken, they actually start mailing more canes to other Southern senators, telling them to use them if necessary. And the reason that this is so noteworthy is that if things are getting this bad in the single state of Kansas, if things are getting this bad in Congress, where people are expected to be kind of the cream of the crop, they're supposed to be the best and brightest among Americans, if it's getting this violent in Kansas and in Congress, what hope does the nation have? And again, at this point, we are 5 years away from the Civil War, so things are still going to get worse. But the Civil War is coming closer. It's not looking like things are getting any better. And for the next several years, people that were in Congress, they came to Congress and they had pistols in their pockets and knives in their pockets. They were ready to fight, sometimes maybe even kill over this issue. Things were going from bad to worse. Now on to 1857, to one of the more landmarked cases in Supreme Court cases in American history, Dred Scott versus Sandford. So in 1857, the Supreme Court is going to make a ruling about slavery in the West. And this, to some, seemed like a good idea. People were fighting over slavery in the West, sometimes physically, sometimes verbally. Laws are being passed regarding slavery in the West. And so it's almost natural that the Supreme Court would eventually weigh in on whether or not slavery could go to the West. So what ends up happening is you have a man, the man pictured here on the right, named Dred Scott. He's going to be a slave. And he originally was in a slave-holding territory, and then he's going to be taken by his owner, who was a traveling doctor, if I remember correctly. He's going to be taken by his owner to a free territory, and then his owner dies. And Dred Scott at this point is going to sue, and he's going to say that since his owner has died, and since he is in a territory where slavery is not legal, that means he is now free. The problem for Dred Scott is that 5 of the 9 justices on the Supreme Court are slave-owning justices. And so there will be some bias in this court decision. And in the end, Dred Scott, even though he is in a free state, is not going to get the ruling that he wants. The guy on the left-hand side here, his name is Roger Taney, and he's going to rule against Dred Scott, which is very interesting because in 1861, this man, Roger Taney, is going to swear Abraham Lincoln into the presidency, and many of us already know that it is Abraham Lincoln's presidency that helps lead to the end of slavery. Back to the case. Okay, so in the ruling, there's going to be multiple parts to the Supreme Court ruling. Part number 1 is that, and that's an actual photograph of Dred Scott. Part number 1 of the ruling is that Dred Scott was property. And if a slave is property, property can't sue. If you own a car, your car can't sue. If you are a Southern farmer, your cotton gin can't sue because it's property and it's not citizen. And basically, this ruling says that Dred Scott is also property, therefore not a citizen, therefore not eligible to sue. So this should never have been a court case to begin with. But the ruling goes further than this. The ruling says that if you have property, the Constitution is supposed to protect your property. And if slaves count as property, then the Constitution protects your property as well, your slave property as well. What does that mean about slavery in the West? Well, if slaves are property, and if property is protected by the Constitution, then that means that slavery cannot be banned anywhere, because you can't tell someone they can't take their property somewhere with them. So what the Supreme Court ruling does is it basically says that the entire Western territories are now open to slavery. Had the Missouri Compromise not already been repealed by the Kansas-Nebraska Act, it would have been overturned by this court case. So the reactions to this, the Republicans are going to be very angry because slavery can now spread westward and slavery can now compete with white free labor. Abolitionists especially are going to be angry because they see a basically never-ending spread of slavery. There could be 5 new slave states eventually, maybe 8 new slave states, maybe 10 new slave states. The South might come to dominate in Congress and in the federal government. So Southerners are going to absolutely love this ruling. And this is interesting to note because most of the time the things that happen in the 1850s usually end up angering the South. But this, for the Southerners, was a big victory. What about popular sovereignty? Well, popular sovereignty looks like it doesn't matter anymore because you can't choose whether or not to have a state or a territory that's free or slave. The choice has already been made. You have to allow it anywhere. And that's going to put Senator Stephen Douglas in a very tough spot. He's getting ready to run for re-election for Senate, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Now back to Abraham Lincoln. So in 1858, Abraham Lincoln, who had not been very successful in his past career, remember that he had questioned the Mexican-American War and had been ridiculed as a result. Well, he's going to take another try at being part of the federal government. He's going to run in 1858 against Stephen Douglas. Now, Stephen Douglas had taken a bit of a hit because of how the Kansas-Nebraska Act had gone down, but he was still a master politician, and he was very good at debating. So was Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, remember, or you may not remember, might not know, but he was a lawyer. So Abraham Lincoln is going to make a very bold move. He's pretty much coming out of nowhere, and he's going to run against Stephen Douglas for the Senate to represent the state of Illinois. And Abraham Lincoln very boldly is going to challenge one of the best debaters in the entire nation to a series of debates to see if he can take on Douglas successfully and replace Douglas as a senator for Illinois. And in one of the debates, I believe it was the second of the 7 debates, Lincoln is going to bring up the Dred Scott case, and he's going to say to Stephen Douglas, if you have been championing popular sovereignty, it was a big part of your disastrous Kansas-Nebraska Act, how are you going to reconcile that with the Dred Scott ruling? In other words, if the Dred Scott ruling says that you can't ban slavery anywhere in the territories, then how in the world can popular sovereignty have any impact on slavery in the West? Which was a very clever question, and Stephen Douglas will come up with a very clever answer. So what Stephen Douglas is going to say, and by the way, there is Stephen Douglas there, 5'4". There's Abraham Lincoln, 6'4", full foot of height difference between the two. Not that you need to know that, but it might be interesting. One thing to note about Lincoln is that Lincoln was considered to be very ugly to a lot of people. He was considered to look kind of unkempt, but all that changed once he started to speak. When he spoke, it was almost like he was another human being. His speaking ability was that good. That's going to make him a rising star in the Republican Party, and eventually 2 years later he'll run for president and win for the Republican Party. More on that later on. So back to the question. Abraham Lincoln says to Stephen Douglas, if all the slaves have to allow for slavery, how can your popular sovereignty possibly work out west? And so the answer given in the town of Freeport, Illinois, that's why it's called the Freeport Doctrine, what Douglas is going to say is, sure, we now have to allow slavery in the West, but that does not mean that we have to allow any laws to protect it. So maybe out west we won't have a fugitive slave law. Maybe out west, if your slave runs away, there is no compensation to the owner for losing their so-called property. This would be the equivalent today of saying it's illegal to steal people's cars, but every time someone's car gets stolen, the police don't do anything about it. And what Stephen Douglas is going to say is that if the people of the state don't support any laws that protect slavery, then it won't matter if slavery exists there or not. Because even if it does exist there, it won't be protected by the law, and eventually it'll die out as a result of that. So that was a pretty clever argument called the Freeport Doctrine. But that's not the most important thing about these debates. The most important thing about these debates is that Lincoln loses the election, but has made a name for himself. He is becoming increasingly popular. When people hear him speak, they listen. And he becomes a serious name to a lot of Republicans as a possible candidate in the 1860 presidential election. So in this case, Lincoln kind of loses this battle, but he's going to win the war because eventually he will become nominated for president in 1860, and eventually he will win. And the South takes notice. The South also knows that Lincoln is a skilled orator. He is very intelligent. He is gaining a lot of popularity, and they already didn't like the Republican Party. They already felt threatened by the Republicans because, remember, the Republicans were against slavery in the West. And they feel very threatened because for the first real time, they feel like the Republican Party might have a shot at getting their person elected president. So the South was already afraid of Northern Republicans. They're really afraid of Lincoln because they think that this could be the man that attacks slavery. Meanwhile, if you were to ask Lincoln what his stance on slavery was, he would go with the Republican platform of, we'll allow it in the South, but we don't like it being in the West. So again, the South feels very threatened by Lincoln. Interesting side story, around this time, Stephen Douglas was dating a woman named Mary Todd. He may even have been engaged to her, I'm not sure. But sometime around these debates, Mary Todd is going to break things off with Stephen Douglas, and she's going to decide to start dating and eventually marry Abraham Lincoln. So, fun side story is that Abraham Lincoln stole Stephen Douglas's girlfriend. Now, why did this happen? I think Mary Todd saw more potential in Abraham Lincoln, and she was right. But honestly, Mary Todd historically turned out to be quite a handful of a wife. She had some sanity issues, so maybe Lincoln was the loser in this, and maybe Douglas was the winner. I'll let you decide on that one. Okay, anyway, so the South feels threatened by Lincoln. They feel threatened by the Republicans. They're gearing up for the 1860 election, and if Lincoln wins, they might even leave the United States, or at least try to. One last event to talk about before we get to the election of 1860 that Lincoln will win. Okay, so in 1859, just a year before the election of 1860, just 2 years before the Civil War begins, John Brown does something else violent. John Brown is going to return from Kansas. He's going to hatch a plan. He's going to try to overthrow slavery across the South. And what he's going to do is he's going to go to a town called Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Today it's in West Virginia, but West Virginia doesn't break off from Virginia until midway through the Civil War. And so what John Brown and his followers, which included some of his sons, they're going to go to a federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry. And at this federal arsenal, you're going to have military-grade weapons. Now, Harper's Ferry is in the Appalachian Mountains. And so his plan was to raid this arsenal, escape through the Appalachian Mountains, get further south, and start handing off these military-grade weapons to any abolitionists or any slaves that he could find. And if he did this, he could start a slave rebellion that might prove to be unstoppable. Because remember that if you get 100 or 200 or 300 military-grade weapons to a dozen or so plantations, and then those plantations get taken over by the slaves, and they kill their masters and they take their masters' weapons, this will have a snowball effect, and you could see slavery get overthrown across the South. And this would have been a very nasty event because the U.S. military would have to come in to try to stop this rebellion, and things would have really fallen apart in the South. So again, Brown's plan was to smuggle military weapons into Southern slave hands and hopefully, in his mind, start a major slave rebellion that could not be stopped. And by the way, in the history and modern world history, there have been slave rebellions that have been successful. For example, in Haiti, the Haitian Rebellion. Unfortunately for John Brown, his raid doesn't go very far. He doesn't even get out of the arsenal. Very quickly, the townspeople of Harper's Ferry, they don't want anything to do with this violence. The people of Harper's Ferry are going to come out with their guns. Eventually, the military is going to come in. In fact, Robert E. Lee is going to come in and help capture John Brown. If you don't know who Robert E. Lee is, which I did talk about him briefly before, you definitely will know about him when we get to the Civil War. So Robert E. Lee is going to help capture, along with the townspeople of Harper's Ferry, they're going to capture John Brown, and he will be executed for treason. The picture that you see there on the right, I don't believe ever actually happened, but I do love this painting because of how it captures the attitude of John Brown. John Brown in that painting is being led to be hanged, but he takes a moment to kiss a black baby. So at this point, when John Brown dies, he is going to be seen as a martyr to the cause of abolitionism. Even more Northerners are going to be on board with getting rid of slavery. Maybe not just keeping it from spreading westward, but maybe more Northerners are now actually saying get rid of it everywhere. So here we are in 1859. The North is more anti-slavery than it's ever been before. They've seen a man willing to die for the cause of ending slavery. Meanwhile, Southerners are going to be more fearful than ever. Now remember that Southerners had feared that there were Northern conspiracies to come after slavery before. They hated the idea of being outnumbered in the Senate. And now, for the first time, these fear, or maybe not for the first time, but for a really, this is a really poignant moment, Southern fears in their minds are confirmed. There is an actual conspiracy, there has been an actual conspiracy from a Northerner to attack very violently slavery in the South. And Southerners start to say to themselves, when's the next John Brown going to come along and try to attack slavery? How many more John Browns are there? How many more of these abolitionists are there that are willing to commit such violence to end slavery? And so what you start seeing in a lot of your southern towns and southern states is they start to get their militias together. It's almost like the Revolutionary War. If you remember the American Revolution, you had militias form in different towns and different colonies. Well, the southern towns and the southern counties and southern states are starting to put together militias. And that's important to note. They're doing this because they're afraid of another John Brown. But what ends up happening is once the Civil War breaks out, they pretty much already have their army ready to go. And so these, in the same way that the Minutemen during the American Revolution were kind of merged into becoming the Continental Army, these Southern militias, once the Civil War starts, are going to be merged in more or less into a Confederate army. So here we are on the eve of the election of 1860. Violence has gotten worse. Tension between the North and the South has gotten worse. And really, the election of 1860 will prove to be the defining election really in American history. The election of 1860, I believe, is the most important election in our country's history, where you basically see the issue of slavery in the forefront. And when Abraham Lincoln gets elected, it sparks the secession of southern states from the United States, which then leads to the American Civil War. So this tension that's been building for so long over the course of this class, this tension between the northern states and the southern states, whether we're going to be a country that does or does not allow slavery, it is going to reach its breaking point in the next lecture over the election of 1860. More on that in the next lecture.